Good morning, friends. There exists a belief, often unspoken but deeply felt, that prayer is a sort of cosmic vending machine. Say the right words, press the right buttons, and out comes the desired blessing. But the more one prays, the more one realizes that God is not a genie, and prayer is not a transaction. It is something far greater, an invitation. Prayer is not a mechanical process, nor is it a ritual designed to manipulate divine power. It is, at its very core, a relationship, one that mirrors the connection between a child and a loving father. When we approach God, it is not as distant petitioners presenting requests to an indifferent ruler, but as beloved sons and daughters speaking to a Father who knows us more intimately than we know ourselves. In the Bible, we are said to cry out, Abba, Father, signifying a relationship that is deeply personal, not merely transactional. Yet so often we slip into thinking of prayer as a duty or a tool rather than an act of communion. We may rush through words, hoping to meet an obligation, or repeat phrases with the hidden belief that sheer repetition might make them more effective. But this was never the intention of true prayer. Even Christ, when teaching his disciples, warned against meaningless repetitions and empty phrases, emphasizing instead the sincerity of the heart. When he prayed, he withdrew to quiet places, not to escape the world, but to seek uninterrupted intimacy with the Father. His example teaches us that prayer is not about reciting perfect words, but about dwelling in the presence of God with honesty and faith. Many times we measure the effectiveness of our prayers by whether we receive what we ask for. If an answer comes quickly, we rejoice. If it does not, we assume we have prayed incorrectly or that God is silent. But the power of prayer is not found in the fulfillment of our desires. It is found in the nearness of God. A child may not always understand why a parent delays an answer or redirects their request, but trust is not built on immediate gratification. It is built on the assurance of love. In the Bible, we are said to be still and know that He is God. A reminder that prayer is not always about speaking, but also about listening and resting in divine presence. When Christ walked the earth, his prayers were marked by an unshakable trust in the Father's will. Even in his most agonizing moments, he surrendered, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." This was not a resignation to fate, but a declaration of faith. If the Son of God, who had the power to command legions of angels, chose to submit to the Father's plan, how much more should we? Prayer, then, is not about bending God's will to fit our own, but aligning our hearts with His. And in that alignment, we find the true power of prayer. Not in forcing an outcome, but in deepening our relationship with the One who holds all things in His hands. Many believe that the power of prayer lies in the eloquence of words, as if the right phrases or poetic expressions hold the key to divine response. But prayer is not a performance, nor is it an artful composition designed to impress God. The true essence of prayer is found not in the words themselves, but in the heart that offers them. In the Bible we are said that man looks at outward appearances, but the Lord looks at the heart. It is not the complexity of our speech that moves him, but the sincerity with which we speak. When Christ taught about prayer, he did not commend those who prayed with grand, flowing speeches before others. Instead, he pointed to a tax collector who simply bowed his head and whispered, God, have mercy on me, a sinner." This man, though he lacked the polished words of the religious elite, was justified before God because his heart was humble. There we go. There is a temptation to think that if we pray with more passion, if we raise our voices, or if we repeat our requests enough times, we will be heard. But God does not respond to volume, He responds to faith. In the Bible, we are said to come before Him with confidence, knowing that He hears us not because of our many words, but because we are His children. Even in our weakest moments, when words fail us and all we can muster is a sigh or a tear, God understands. Prayer is not about informing God of our needs. He already knows them. It is about opening our hearts to Him, allowing His presence to meet us in our brokenness. When Jesus stood before the tomb of Lazarus, He did not craft an elaborate speech. He simply lifted His eyes and thanked the Father, and the miracle followed. This was not because of a perfect arrangement of words, but because the prayer was filled with trust. In the Bible, we are said that the Spirit intercedes for us when we do not know what to pray, translating even our groanings into words before God. There are times when silence speaks louder than words. Christ, in His final moments on the cross, cried out in agony, yet also trusted in the Father's plan. Sometimes the most powerful prayer is not spoken but surrendered in the quiet of our hearts. The measure of effective prayer is not how beautifully it is spoken, but how fully it is surrendered. When Jesus prayed in the garden, He asked for the cup to be taken from Him, yet He did not demand it. Instead, He yielded. That moment of surrender was the ultimate prayer, one that changed the course of eternity. If we would learn this, if we would let go of the belief that our words must be perfect, and instead focus on bringing God a heart that is honest, humble, and willing, then we would find that even the simplest prayers are filled with the greatest power. One of the greatest struggles in prayer is not the act of praying itself, but understanding how God responds. There is a common expectation that if we pray correctly, if our faith is strong enough, and if we ask with sincerity, the answer will always be yes. But anyone who has walked with God for any length of time knows that His answers are not always what we expect. Sometimes He grants what we ask immediately. Other times He asks us to wait. And sometimes He denies our request altogether, not out of neglect, but out of a wisdom far beyond our own. In the Bible, we are said that His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and His ways are higher than our ways. There are moments when prayers seem to be met with silence, and doubt begins to creep in. But silence is not absence, and delay is not denial. God's timing is not measured by human clocks, nor is His wisdom confined to our understanding. When Lazarus was sick, his sisters sent word to Jesus, fully expecting Him to come at once. Yet Jesus delayed, and Lazarus died. From a human perspective, it seemed as though their prayers had gone unanswered. But what they could not see was that a greater miracle was unfolding. When Christ finally arrived, He did not simply heal the sick, He raised the dead. In the Bible, we are said that to everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven. At times, God's answer is no, and it is in those moments that faith is truly tested. The Apostle Paul, a man through whom miracles flowed, prayed earnestly for a thorn in his flesh to be removed, yet the answer was not healing but grace. God did not take away the struggle, He strengthened Paul through it. This was not rejection, but a deeper revelation of God's power in weakness. In the Bible, we are said that His grace is sufficient and His strength is made perfect in weakness. There is a greater purpose in every unanswered prayer, though it may not be visible at the time. Even Christ Himself, in the Garden of Gethsemane, prayed that the cup of suffering might pass from Him. If there was ever a prayer that should have been answered with a yes, surely it was this one. And yet, the will of the Father was greater. Had the prayer been granted, redemption would not have come. What seemed in the moment to be a denial was, in truth, the unfolding of the greatest victory. In the Bible, we are said that all things work together for good to those who love God. It is easy to trust when the answer is yes, but true faith is found in trusting when the answer is no, believing that even in the silence, even in the waiting, and even in the denial, God is still working all things for our good and His glory. Prayer is not merely about presenting requests before God. It is about aligning our hearts with His will. Many approach prayer as a means to change their circumstances, but true prayer first changes the one who prays. There is a difference between asking God to bless our plans and surrendering to His. The most powerful prayers are not those that seek to bend God's will to our desires, but those that bring us into alignment with what He has already ordained. In the Bible, we are said that when we delight ourselves in the Lord, He will give us the desires of our hearts. This does not mean He grants every wish, but that when our hearts are fully yielded to Him, our desires begin to reflect His own. Obedience is the key that unlocks the power of prayer. Many wonder why their prayers seem ineffective, yet they live in opposition to the very things God has commanded. A heart that clings to sin cannot expect to experience the fullness of answered prayer. In the Bible, we are said that if we cherish iniquity in our hearts, the Lord will not hear us. This is not because He refuses to listen, but because rebellion places a barrier between us and Him. A life that seeks His power without submitting to His authority is like a branch that expects fruit without remaining connected to the vine. Jesus made it clear that apart from Him, we can do nothing. It is only when we abide in Him, when we walk in obedience, that our prayers bear fruit. Christ Himself demonstrated this truth in every aspect of His life. He did not pray independently of the Father's will, but in perfect harmony with it. Even when He faced the greatest suffering, He did not demand an escape but surrendered, saying, "Not my will but yours be done." This was not a passive acceptance of suffering, but an active trust in the wisdom and goodness of God. His obedience led to the greatest victory, one that secured salvation for all who believe. In the Bible, we are said that though Christ was a son, He learned obedience through what He suffered. If the Son of God walked in complete submission, how much more should we? Many seek answers in prayer while resisting the very path that leads to them. They ask for guidance, but refuse to follow when the answer requires sacrifice. They ask for peace, but hold on to bitterness. They ask for blessings, but walk in disobedience. The prayers that move mountains are the prayers that come from a heart fully surrendered. In the Bible, we are said that when we seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, all these things will be added to us. The power of prayer is not found in mere words, but in a life that is yielded to God. When we align ourselves with Him, when we desire what He desires, and when we walk in obedience, our prayers are not just heard, They are answered in ways beyond what we could ask or imagine. There is a mystery in prayer that many struggle to understand. Why does God sometimes delay His answers? Why must we keep praying when He already knows what we need? The truth is that prayer is not simply about making requests. It is about faith and persistence. A faith that gives up easily is not faith at all. And a heart that stops praying when answers do not come immediately reveals a shallow trust. In the Bible, we are said that without faith is not just believing that God can answer prayer, it is trusting Him, even when the answer is not yet visible. Abraham was promised a son, yet he waited years before the promise was fulfilled. Joseph had dreams of leadership, yet he endured betrayal, slavery, and prison before they came true. Hannah wept bitterly for a child, year after year before God granted her request. None of these prayers were answered instantly, but in the waiting, faith was strengthened. In the Bible, we are said that those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. The delay was never a denial. It was preparation for something greater. The greatest example of persistence in prayer is found in Jesus Himself. In the Garden of Gethsemane, knowing the suffering that lay ahead, He prayed not once, but 3 times. He poured out His heart before the Father, not because He doubted, but because He fully entrusted Himself to God's will. His persistence was not about changing the Father's mind, but about submitting to it completely. This is the heart of powerful prayer. Not demanding an outcome, but continuing to seek, continuing to trust, continuing to believe, even when nothing seems to change. In the Bible, we are said that the fervent prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. The prayers that move mountains are the ones that refuse to be discouraged, that hold fast in faith, and that persist even when the answer is unseen. For it is in the waiting, the wrestling, and the unwavering trust that prayer truly becomes powerful. Many approach prayer with the hope of changing their circumstances, believing that its greatest power is in altering the world around them. While prayer does invite God to move in situations, its deeper and more lasting work is in transforming the one who prays. There is a refining process in coming before God, a shaping of the heart that takes place when a person kneels in humility, surrenders their desires, and aligns themselves with divine wisdom. In the Bible, we are said to be like clay in the hands of the potter, molded according to his purpose. Prayer is not just about presenting needs, but about allowing God to shape character, deepen faith, and draw the soul into closer communion with Him. Many have prayed for a change in circumstances, only to find that God first changes them. A person may pray for patience, but rather than simply receiving it, they are given situations that require endurance. Someone may ask for peace, but instead of an instant sense of calm, they are led through trials where they must learn to trust. This is the way of God, for He is more concerned with transformation than temporary relief. In the Bible, we are said that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance builds character, and character strengthens hope. The struggles that drive people to prayer are often the very tools God uses to refine them. Even when prayer does not bring the immediate answers expected, it creates an unshakable dependence on God. When Paul prayed for his thorn in the flesh to be removed, the answer was not healing but grace. He learned that true strength is found not in the absence of struggle, but in God's sufficiency. The deepest work of prayer is not in making life easier, but in drawing the heart into greater reliance on the one who sustains all things. In the Bible, we are said that when we seek Him with all our hearts, we will find Him. The greatest result of prayer is not merely the resolution of problems, but a greater revelation of God Himself. Jesus prayed, not because He lacked power, but because He lived in complete communion with the Father. His prayers were not just requests, they were moments of abiding, of surrender, of aligning with the will of God. Even in His darkest hour, when faced with suffering beyond comprehension, His prayer was not for escape, but for the fulfillment of the Father's purpose. In the Bible, we are said to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, and there is no greater renewal than what happens in the presence of God through prayer. The power of prayer is not only in what it changes outwardly, but in the way it shapes the soul, strengthens faith, and brings the heart into harmony with the eternal purposes of God. In the end, the most profound work of prayer is not in altering circumstances, but in making us more like Christ. Prayer is far more than a means of asking and receiving. It is the lifeline of a transformed life, shaping the soul and drawing it into deeper intimacy with God. It is not measured by eloquence, but by sincerity, not by immediate answers, but by unwavering trust. True prayer is marked by faith, persistence, and surrender, aligning our hearts with God's will rather than demanding our own way. In the waiting, in the silence, and even in the unanswered prayers, God is at work, refining character, strengthening faith, and drawing us closer to Him. The greatest power of prayer is not in changing circumstances, but in changing us, making us more like Christ, teaching us to trust, and leading us into a life of complete dependence on God. When we embrace this, we discover that every prayer, answered or not,